before you guys looked at the agenda for today, who had no idea who I was? All right, fair. No one brings me in because they want to feel comfortable. Stalin! This is the most important dude to live in the last half millennia, not because of what he did, but because of who he scared, us. We were so terrified in 1945 of having to face down the Red Armies on the plains of Europe. We needed people who would stand in front of us. We needed cannon fodder to absorb ammo. And since the Europeans had just been through the worst war in recorded history, we knew that the inducement to get that sort of cooperation was going to have to be a lot. So we sent our Navy out to patrol the global ocean so that anyone could go anywhere at any time and interface with any partner and access any market and any commodity if in exchange you'd put on a bulletproof bullet catcher for us. And it worked. It gave us the alliance that we need. And then, between 89 and 92, the wall fell, the Soviet Union went away, and we started down the path of an ever more narcissistic series of internal political contests in which, in 8 presidential elections in a row, we chose the guy who wanted less to do with the world. Now, there's a lot that comes from this. Security issues, the energy markets, wherever you want to take it, we can go. This is net worth by decade, and it's a story you are all very familiar with. As you get older, you get better at your job, you start a business, your net worth goes up. The real magic happens in North America when you turn 50. Because on average in North America, when you turn 50, your single biggest expense, your youngest kid, becomes someone else's problem. And the money that you save by being an empty nester, you tend to use to pay down your second biggest expense, and that's your homestead. So on average, by 55, you're out of debt, your expenses are under control, your income's at an all-time high, and the money that you saved for your preparation for retirement between 55 and 65, that is 70% of global private capital. That is literally where the money is. That's what drives the whole system. And then you retire, whether you turn 65, and you liquidate those investments and you go into stocks and bonds, low velocity activity. And for those of you who are boomers, you are not the exception. If anything, you're the proof. Because if there's anything we understand about the millennials, your kids, it's that they see cohabitation with their parents as a one-way experience. You turn 65, you're on your own. There's no safety blanket for you. Kind of a boring story, no surprises there, but Stalin changed the way this worked because he changed the way we live. It used to be we all lived on farms. And when you live on farms, you have as many kids as you can put up with. And so we used to have a demographic profile like this. This is the Koreans at the dawn of the globalized era. You got children at the bottom, young adults, mature adults, retirees at the top, men on one side, women on the other. This is a very specific sort of economic model because whenever the population bulges under roughly age 45, it's about consumption, raising kids, building homes, new at your job, low income, low tax base. You don't have those 55 to 65-year-olds to pay for everything. So capital is expensive. It's hard to come by. Growth is high, inflation is high, but investment is low. But Stalin changed this because all of a sudden our reaction to Stalin creating the global economy meant that anyone could go out and get a services or a manufacturing job, and all of those jobs were in town. And when you move from the farm to the city, kids are no longer free labor. So we had fewer of them. And 75 years on, here's where the Koreans are now. Radically different economic model. Now you've got a bulge of people in that capital-rich demographic, people who have been at their careers for decades, highest skilled workers in the world, huge amount of investment flowing into the system, great mid-career training, lots of technology, lots of government services, but no consumption down below. So instead of an inflationary environment, you get a disinflationary one. Instead of expensive capital, you get relatively cheap capital. Now, the whole world has made this transition. Different starting points, different speeds, but we're all on the same road because we've all globalized and industrialized. Now, the Koreans specifically in the next 10 years are going to lead us into something new. Because that bulge, that capital-rich, skill-rich bulge is going to move into mass retirement. And they don't have a replacement generation. So their new social, economic, and political model will need to be one that is based not on production, not on consumption, not on investment. What'll that look like? I have no idea. This has never happened before in human history. Let's look at the big four from the American point of view. Bottom left, Germany. Just as bad as the Koreans, maybe a little worse by some measures, which means if you want a Mercedes, you need to buy it now. Top right, Mexico. If you were to choose one country on this earth that the United States should partner with for purposes of trade, that's the one. It's the youngest demographic, not just in the rich world, but the advanced developing world as well. What we're good at, they aren't, and vice versa. It's a perfect setup, and they're on our border. Now, you'll notice that the pyramid comes down until you hit about the 30-year-olds, and then it goes straight down. You guys remember what happened 30 years ago? NAFTA. You see, if you go back to 1945, the Mexicans were looking at the details of globalization, and they're like, this to us feels a lot like an American security program. Sign us out. We want nothing to do with this. Until the wall fell, and they're like, okay, let's talk about bilateral deals. And we got NAFTA out of it. So they didn't start down the road towards industrialization and urbanization until about 1995. Since then, their birth rates dropped by 2/3. But if they keep aging at their current rate, they won't hit a German, Korean-style problem until at least 2080. And in the meantime, this means that they're running out of young people. Net migration from Mexico to the US for the last 15 years has been flat to negative. The people crossing aren't Mexican. They're Central American. You'll notice they've got a similar shape, just 5 years younger. Because 5 years after NAFTA was operationalized, we codified CAFTA, the Central American Free Trade Agreement. So whatever you think about what's going on at the southern border, keep this in mind. By 2030, the Central Americans will run out of people, and we're going to have a very different conversation about the border. Top left, us, we're a little different. We're kind of the odd ducks demographically. Not a lot of states look like this, more of a chimney. A couple reasons for that. First, globalization was a security program. If we had invested our economy into the global commons, it wouldn't have been a bribe. We would have just been another empire, and nobody wanted part of that. Second, U.S. has a lot of elbow room. So we were able to not go from farm to city. We went from farm to small town to suburb to city. And those two intermediate steps drew out the process of dropping the birth rate. If we keep aging at our current rate, we won't have a Korean German style problem until about 2070. A lot of time to figure out another path. And then there's the Chinese. This is already one of the 5 fastest aging workforces in the historical record. This is data from last June. And last July, the Chinese finally admitted that this data is wrong. Now look at that bottom tier. Here's the revision as of July. The Chinese are now reporting that since 2017, they'd have a faster decline in their birth rate than what happened to the Jews of Europe during the Holocaust. It doesn't include COVID data yet. And this data is wrong. The Shanghai Academy of Sciences, who are a group of wise men who basically interpret government data, say that this overestimates the real statistics by about 100 million people, with all of the missing millions people who would have been born during the one-child policy, which is another way of saying that the missing millions are all under age 40, suggesting that these yellow bars don't even exist. This is now the mid-case scenario for Chinese data. There are a number of independent demographers in China, several of which are now under house arrest, who say that the real missing millions number isn't 100 million, it's closer to 250. There is no economic model that humans have yet invented that will sustain a system like this in less than 10 years' time. We are less than a decade away from the end of China as a unified, industrialized nation state. And in the corporate world, that has got to redefine a few things. Let's talk about us. It thrills me to say this, but the baby boomers don't matter much anymore. As of the fourth quarter of calendar year 2022, the majority of America's boomers had already moved into retirement and liquidated their savings. Now, this takes us a few places, two big ones. Number one, capital. It's already gone, half gone anyway. We've seen a tripling in capital costs in the United States in the last 4 years. It's not Trump, it's not Biden, it's not the Fed, it's not the business cycle. It's the boomers rolling one last grenade into the room on their way out. Bastards. Second, labor. Largest generation ever is another way of saying largest workforce ever. Half of them are already gone. That's a big part of the inflation story. Bigger problem, the new generation coming at the bottom, the Zoomers, are the smallest generation we've ever had. The difference between the exiting boomers and entering Zoomers this year, just this year, is a shortage just this year of 700,000 workers. That number will increase each and every year for the next 11 before peaking at just over 1 million workers shortage for 1 year. How do we know? They're already here. We know exactly what the inflow into the labor market is for the next 20 years. They're already alive. There's not a lot that policy can do about that. However, there is a light at the end of the tunnel. It is not a train. There is hope because of the millennials. The oldest millennials this year turn 45. Now that takes us 3 places. Number one, we are at the dawn of the greatest period of reality television in human history. Because over the next 15 years, the millennials will, in a rolling process, all be going through their midlife crises. Drama. Second, in 10 years, the millennials will be entering their mid-50s, and they will be entering that capital-rich period of their life. And we will finally see some of the pressure come off of capital markets. Third, the millennials are a large generation. Just like their parents, the boomers are a large generation. Just like their kids, Generation Alpha will be a large generation. Which means all we have to do to get back to what we would consider a more normal labor market is wait for Generation Alpha to be born, to grow up, to get trained and enter the workforce, which will happen in the millions in 2045. Hire, borrow, hire, borrow, hire, borrow. If you remember nothing else from this presentation, remember those 2 words. This is the cheapest labor market for 20 years and the cheapest capital market for 10. And I don't care what your industry is, that reshapes everything. X doesn't get a lot of love, probably because we're all in this room right now. A few things set X apart from the others. When Gen X looks at the baby boomers, one of the primary reasons we just feel this sense of like intense disgust is it's a family issue. There were so many boomers when they entered the workforce in the 60s, 70s, and 80s that they pushed down the cost of labor. They competed with one another. That's why they're the most mobile generation we've ever had. They went to wherever the jobs were. It also happened to coincide with the rise of the women's liberation movement because economically, a lot of 2-parent households discovered that one income wasn't enough. So the second spouse entered the workforce. That put a lot of pressure on the family unit. There's a reason why the boomers have the highest divorce rate in our history. Gen X looks at that and says, no, we will not make those mistakes. We reserve the right to make our own mistakes, and we've made some. But we're far more likely to be single income households with far more stable interpersonal relationships as a result. Now, we have paid for that because we have been the low men and women on the totem pole our entire working careers until 4 years ago when the baby boomers started going away. And even if we all wanted to work, and I assure you, we do not, there would have never been enough of us to fill all those shoes. So we have gone from being the perpetual intern generation with the lowest increases in take-home pay of any generation ever to now the highest. Now, the bottom line of all this is that Gen X values their time at least as much as their money, where it was flipped for the boomers. And for you folks, that means there's an entire investment asset class that's going tits up. because Gen X are the ones making the decisions now. And the only thing that Gen X hates more than being in the office is the commute to get to the office. Be forewarned. All right, let's look around the country real quick. Top left is Texas, bottom left is California. This is a racial breakdown. So the orange in the middle, that's the gringos. The blues are Hispanics, and then on. California and Texas. Those are the two most similar demographic structures and ethnic breakdowns of any two states in the Union. If anyone tries to tell you that race is anything other than a starting point for the conversation on political alignment, tell them to stuff it. Now, fun thing, see this bulge of millennials? You guys remember how all the stories happen of the millennials wanting to go out and get their coastal urban experience? California, in terms of numbers, was the state that benefited the most from that. But here's you. See, fun fact about the millennials, there's two kinds. There's the ones who have always done everything we demanded of them. Graduated from school early, they didn't go off to Europe for 5 years to find themselves, they went straight into the workforce. And then there's the ones that meet the other stereotypes that, they still haven't gotten up for their first hour of work this week. Two types. Both of them went out for that urban coastal experience. The ones that were willing to work came back. The bulge in California are the ones that didn't come back. The bulge in Colorado are the ones that did. You guys got the good ones. You look at worker productivity data for that age block, it's very plain. You have a fundamentally unique worker demographic compared to the rest of the country. You're the only one, aside from Texas, that brought in a surge of the good millennials. We'll come back to that. Top right, the Northeast. Where did Missouri come from? Check this out. Now, the Northeast is the oldest and the fastest aging part of the country. They've got this big bulge of people that are getting a little crotchety. You guys all have uncles and aunts and grandparents, right? You know how when they retired, there was a lot of in my day conversations. When you retire, you tend to become more socially conservative. We think of the Northeast as the country's liberal bastion, but it is the most quickly evolving one politically. And it's not going to be too long from now before we start thinking of it as Trump country. And then the bottom right is Florida, and it's full of old people, just like you would expect. Here is Arizona, very different shape. The difference between Florida and Arizona is that Florida is full of old people, and Arizona is full of old white people. There's a difference. Arizona does not have a labor problem. Arizona has a bilingual training problem. That's a lot easier to solve. Let's talk about the Chinese via Southeast Asia. Here are some monthly wages for some Southeast Asian countries that I think are going to do really well as the world deglobalizes. Here are our Mexican compadres right in the middle, hyper competitive. And here are the Chinese. Fastest increase in labor costs in human history, outpacing the Black Death and every recorded war. The Chinese labor cost has gone up by more than 15 since the year 2000, but labor productivity has yet to triple. There is not an economic subsector today where I have had a conversation with anyone in it in the last 3 years, where they have reshored or friendshored or nearshored or whatever you want to call it, and they haven't discovered a simpler supply chain system with fewer steps that uses less energy, that is less pollutive, and above all, is cheaper. The only reason we still think of China as an industrial superpower is because of the sunk cost of the industrial plant. And that's $35 trillion. You don't move away from that overnight. That's a big deal. It's just a question of pace. But hopefully you're starting to realize that they are on borrowed time and pace really matters. So let's talk about things near and dear to you. This is the private capital curve. This is all capital from all sources to all destinations in the private sector. You want to buy a city, you want to buy a stick of gum, you want to finance it, it's all in here. Everything except for the overnight rate. Everything else. From 2000 at the beginning of this graphic to 2007 in the middle, that's the subprime build. We doubled total private credit in 7.5 years. Too much, too fast. We had a recession, knocked 5% off of headline GDP. Everyone remember that? Well, maybe not the millennials. Everyone else? Remember how much fun that was not? All right, this is our baseline. Same data, different scale. Again, the bump in the middle is a double. Here's Germany. If you're in Germany and you want to buy a house, you don't get your 20% down payment together and go to the bank to finance the rest. Now you go, you declare your intentions, like, great, give us a check today for what you anticipate your monthly payment being. Then come back next month and do that again, and again, and again, and again, and again, and again. Do that 60 times. And after 5 years, after you've proven to us that you're not a credit risk, then, only then, can you apply for the loan. The German system has a large number of problems, several of which I argue are system killing. Credit overextension is not one of them. That's more of a Greece problem. We all know this story, 7-fold increase in credit in 7 years, knocked out a depression that was twice as bad as the Great Depression. Before they got to COVID and the data stopped meeting anything, knocked 55% off of the headline GDP. Here's India. You guys remember TARP, our restitution program to recover from the subprime crisis and set the stage for recovery? The Indians had something very similar. There was just one big difference. If you wanted to access their equivalent of TARP funds, you had to be a personal friend of the prime minister. And here are the Chinese. As my Aunt Mary is somewhat infamous for saying, are you fucking kidding me? This is what we've been intimidated by? This is the Enron model in nation-state form. We know how this ends. We know how this always ends. Now, it's infected every economic subsector. You guys have heard what's going on with housing, I'm sure. There are more never lived in condo units. Sorry, let me rephrase that. There are sufficient never lived in condo units that if they all opened their doors, they could put up an extra 1.5 to 3 billion people. These things are worth maybe 10 cents on the dollar, and they're the sink for 70% of private savings in China. That's not even the sector that's affected the most. That would be agriculture. So when this goes down, and it will go down, they don't only have something worse than the subprime crisis in every economic subsector at the same time. They don't just wipe out private savings with the political connotations of that. They also get a famine. There are many things about China that I worry about. Their strength, their durability, their lasting, their power. None of those make the list. I'm worried about how they end. Now, this is normally where you would have a conversation about how a properly informed government with all the tools of power that didn't have to worry about pesky interest groups could look at all the facts, figure out a plan, set their sight on the horizon, and chart a course for the country in a different path. Yeah, that is not the government that China has. China has a cult of personality. And systematically over the last 14 years, Chairman Xi has purged the system of anyone who is capable of conscious thought or has any real talent. He started with the local governments, worked in the provinces, then he worked on academia and the bureaucracy. Now he's doing the business community and the military. There's no one left. They've even stopped collecting, not distributing, collecting data that might accidentally prove embarrassing. The bond market, no data. College dissertations, nothing. Youth unemployment, gone. But I think the best example I can give you is that stupid balloon.